Hi, everyone, and welcome back. So, last time we talked about Anthem, and today we're going to be talking about Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. There he is as a younger man. The title of this book is actually a literary allusion. And a literary allusion is when an author refers to something outside of the text. Sometimes this is something famous, a quotation, a person, another work of literature, a piece of artwork. And in this case, it refers to a quotation from a play by William Shakespeare. How many goodly creatures are there here? How beauteous mankind is. Oh, brave new world that has such people in it. This is something that is said in the original play by a character who is coming into a new world and is fascinated by it. And similarly, in Huxley's book, Brave New World, the idea is that society has entered into this brave new world, this new phase of development where science and logic have sort of overtaken everything and made what is seemingly a perfect utopian state where everyone is happy all the time. And as we know from the first lecture I gave about dystopian literature, that is oftentimes how these dystopians start out. That you have a group of people who are reacting to chaos, trying to create a more controlled society where they will keep out things like war and hunger and disease and famine and all of the things that make us unhappy. And Huxley is sort of showing us some of the dangers in creating that kind of a world. So where we last left off, we talked about Ayn Rand's book, Anthem. Anthem was actually written and published after Brave New World. I start with Anthem for two reasons. Number one, because we had a half-week term, if you're still listening to this in the winter term. If not, sorry, I'm reusing this PowerPoint. But in the winter, we have a half-week term, and so I wanted something a little bit shorter that could kind of introduce us to the subgenre of science fiction known as dystopian literature. The other thing is that Anthem has what I've written here, the bones of a dystopian novel. So there's a totalitarian society, individuality has been erased, you have collectivism, which we talked about at length because of things that Ayn Rand saw in her time in communist Russia. And during the revolution, a hero and heroine fighting the system. The thing about Ayn Rand's novel, while I think it's a good introduction, it's really quite a thin book. So the society, we understand how it's structured, but there's no one person in particular that the hero is fighting against, right? It's sort of this group of people, and he wants to be a scholar. And particularly the golden one, who he falls for, Liberty, and I forget the number at the moment, but his name is Equality, her name is Liberty. She doesn't really play any role at all other than being a female counterpart to him and someone who can just be his love interest. Now, the women in this book are kind of playing that same role. So I want you to watch for that. And another thing I'd like you to watch for is when we get to The Handmaid's Tale, how that trope of dystopian literature is kind of tipped upside down. But in comparison to Ayn Rand's Anthem, we have a lot of the same concepts here. Collectivism, everyone belonging to everyone else, a caste system. The difference is that in Anthem, science has devolved, in Brave New World, science has evolved. And so you have people living in a highly scientific society, and the concepts are similar but altered because of that. So we'll talk about a few of the concepts in this book. We'll talk about the science of this book. In this first lecture, I'll show you just how the society is set up and some basic plot points. And then in the second lecture, I'll go into a little bit more analysis, and we'll also talk about Huxley's other works and and how he used some of the same concepts that he talks about in Brave New World in an essay called Brave New World Revisited, and then in another piece of fiction, a novel called Island. But what I think is interesting about the book is how the society is set up, how science is being used, and also different types of people living in the society. So we get a lot more viewpoints, I think, in this book than the other books that we're reading. So some terms before we start. An oligarchy, government in which a small group of people holds power. Now, in Ayn Rand's Anthem, we had a totalitarian society that seemed to be an autocracy. An autocracy is one person controlling things. In Brave New World, there are 10 world rulers that form the oligarchy. The other term that I want you to know is meritocracy. Meritocracy is the idea that the most intelligent people, the most able and talented people are the people ruling, rather than class privilege or wealth. So as opposed to an aristocracy where it's ruled by kings and queens, right? A meritocracy are people that rule by merit. And in some ways, Brave New World is leadership by able and talented people instead of just by money or by birth. It is by birth, I'm sorry, but it's not birth into an aristocracy, into a lordship or anything like that. And it's also not the same kind of collectivism that we saw in Ayn Rand's Anthem. So it's not done in that exact way. But we'll talk about why it's a meritocracy later on. So a little bit about the author. There he is a slightly older man. Aldous Huxley was born in 1894 into a family that actually had many members of what would be the intellectual elite. So his grandfather was a biologist who helped develop the theory of evolution. He was known as Darwin's dog because he was very faithful to Charles Darwin and tried to stir up other scientists to believe Darwin's theories. And it is possible that without Thomas Henry Huxley, we wouldn't know about Darwin's theories. He was sort of the mouthpiece in a way. Aldous Huxley's mother died when he was 14. At 16, he contracted an illness that made him nearly blind. And there is some evidence that the eye problems that he had contributed to his fiction. In this story, we have what are called the feelies, which are sort of like movies, except you feel them more than just see them and hear them. So some things like that. And also the way he describes things, much more tactile. After marrying, he traveled with his wife and child, and they lived in England, Italy, the United States. 1919 would have been after the First World War. He wasn't allowed to serve because of his eyesight. In Italy, when they lived there, the fascist government led by Benito Mussolini was starting up. And so some of the troubling things he saw in Italy also contributed to some of his philosophical beliefs, which are definitely incorporated in this book. In the United States, he saw things that troubled him even more. So here is a quote from Huxley himself. In places of public amusement, there in dancing and motoring, nowhere, perhaps, is there so little conversation. It is all movement and noise, like the water gurgling out of a bath down the waist. Yes, down the waist. So some of the things he saw in Italy were troubling to him. You know, this is before... He's writing Brave New World before Stalin, before Hitler, but Benito Mussolini is another dictator who was quite harsh, and we don't hear about him as much as we do with the other two. But the other thing, in addition to that, the autocracy and the fascist government of Italy, the idea here that in the U.S., that we're so amused we don't have time for conversation, And the conversation we do have is wasteful and pointless and purposeless. You know, that endless small talk, the chatter on Twitter, those types of things. Even in the 1920s, some of the things that he saw. If you've ever read The Great Gatsby, I think you kind of get the idea of what he's talking about here. And if you haven't, you're kind of living it right now, I think. The family eventually settled in Hollywood, which is interesting to me given how he feels about entertainment. Huxley was a screenwriter as well, something that Ayn Rand also did. And we have a video clip of him elsewhere in Blackboard talking, so I'd like you to watch that so you can get a little bit better sense of him and some of his ideas. But one of the things that also marks some of his fiction is that initially he was an agnostic and grew up an agnostic. You can imagine even in the 1800s, early 1900s, his family members were supporters of Darwin. That would have been quite controversial, and they were not people of faith. So after living in Hollywood, he began studying Hinduism. He began experimenting with mescaline and LSD. This would have been after the period of our book. So if you ever want to read the almost a companion book, Island, I don't think that it's as good of a story, but it has some interesting concepts there and some things that were definitely influenced by his study of Hinduism and these experiments in his later life. Overall, throughout his life, he wrote 47 books, many nonfiction books, as well as the fiction that we are reading in this class. He died in 1963, the same day as John F. Kennedy, and in many ways, his death of natural causes was sort of overshadowed by Kennedy's death, because when John F. Kennedy died, the whole world took notice, even people in England, where Huxley was from. And so later on, the year after, they tried to give him more of a tribute. So some historical background. As I said, this book is written in 1931, so it's before World War II, before Hitler, before Stalin. I'm so sorry about that. It's what happens when you forget to turn your phone off before you record. So one of the things that influenced this book in Great Britain, to a certain extent now, but even more back then, society is broken up into categories. So you have here, I'm going to zoom in on this. We have these like levels where you have the aristocrats, the royal family, and the lords underneath them, and then the states, the officers of the state, like baronets, knights, etc. So you have lords and ladies and knights and dukes and all of that. Then you have the middle class, which is kind of divided into the upper middle class, the lower middle class, and then the lower class with the working class, the labor, the factory workers, the seamstresses, the miners, the sweepers, and then you have the non-working poor. We have this, you know, it would be a lie to say that we don't have this in the United States. We definitely have, you know, what's been called recently the 1% and the 99%. But I do think that the United States is a little bit more susceptible to people moving up and down that ladder from one class to another, right? You have somebody like Samuel Walton, who kind of came from nothing, started a 5 and dime store, eventually grew that into Walmart. That's not the kind of thing that would happen as much in other countries, but particularly not at this point in time in Great Britain, where the class structure is really almost predetermined by birth. So one of the things that you can see, one of the things that Huxley is concerned about, and the concern is demonstrated in this novel, is the over-categorization of people. That, you know, if you're born into a wealthy family, In the UK, you go to Oxford or you go to Cambridge. That's it. Those are your choices. If you're born into a middle class family, there might be a school or two that you can go to. And if you're born into a lower class family, you're not going to college, right? That is the type of thing that he was very worried about and did not approve of, and particularly after living in the United States and after living in other countries, he sort of saw the dangers in that system. He also became concerned with psychology. He had people in his family who were psychologists. He himself thought about going into psychology and thought about becoming a medical doctor as well, but his eyesight kind of kept him from doing that. But the use of psychology to manipulate people as opposed to heal them is something that he was worried about. So, psychology as a science, as it was coming into being in the 1930s, people were looking at not only talk therapy that Freud had looked at in the 1800s, but also, things like brainwashing techniques, things like subliminal advertising, sleep teaching, which sort of actually sort of works on some level. It works with basic instinct things if you listen to things in your sleep, but it doesn't work to actually teach you concepts. So don't try to press play on this and then fall asleep, please. But he was also looking at things like the use of drugs, the use of media, eventually leading into pornography and numbing the senses. So take a pill and everything will be fine. He attacks, which I think is sort of interesting. We looked at Marxism and communism in Ayn Rand's book, and there are things that Marx was worried about philosophically that led him to a philosophy of communism, which in practice obviously is much different. But the rise of factories, the lower classes kind of being entrapped in factories and used like drones, mass production, huge monopolies, the fear that man is going to be reduced to a cog in the machine. Workers are no more than part of the economic manufacturing apparatus. So these are things that actually are disconcerting to Huxley as well. And it's interesting to me that they're not things that Ayn Rand found troubling. She sort of ignores the idea that a corporation could use a member of society in this way, right? And focuses solely on the government and collectivism. But Huxley did not. So that's something I'd like you to look for while you're reading this book. How are people anesthetized by things like the media? How is psychology being used? How are they overcategorized? And then also, how are some people used just as, kind of drone workers for the upper classes? Interestingly enough, Huxley also attacks the results of communism. So while he's concerned that people will be pulled into factories and used for their labor, he's also worried about collectivism and the fascism that he saw in Italy and the ways that collectivism didn't work. The idea that everyone belongs to everyone else, which is repeated. That's a picture of Benito Mussolini. The idea that everyone belongs to everyone else is an idea that is repeated throughout the novel. So look for where that's used and how people react to that phrase. Also, the censorship of history, of literature, and of free thought. Now, in Anthem, we also had a censorship of science, and you actually surprisingly have sort of a censorship of science in this book as well, which is talked about toward the end. So what types of science are valued? Last time we talked about North Korea, and I think it's sort of similar in this book, that they're using science for specific things, to look at specific things, but for other things, they're not willing to consider it. So and the way that history has been kind of rewritten. When we get to the book Matched, history has pretty much almost been erased. So a lot of the same concepts, but again, coming out in really different ways, and that's what I find interesting. So that's some of the background. Sorry, that's some of the background going on behind the scenes in this book. The start of fascism, the categorization of people, the mass production going on in factories, the use of psychology, and in some places, collectivism and communism kind of rising up. So how does this come out in the story? Meet the caste system. Meet the caste. It's sort of a play on words there. You have a different caste system in this society, meaning that people are categorized into their place. The book begins with a very long tour of the London Hatchery and Conditioning Center. And it would be a mistake to skim over this. I think a lot of people skim the first couple chapters because of how much science is there. And in a way, it's sort of like Jurassic Park. If you ever actually read the book of Jurassic Park, Michael Crichton starts it out exactly this way. He gives you the science first because the whole rest of the book is based on that science. So what's going on at the hatchery? How are people being made? How are people being psychologically conditioned? And then how does it affect each and every character? Because some of the people in the book are betas who react one way, some are epsilons who react another way, and most of them that it's focused on are alphas, who kind of know a lot more about the conditioning and yet are sort of susceptible to it anyway. So we learn about the science supporting the society and the strict caste system. I'm going to zoom in on this because I think that it explains it better. The alphas are the intellectually superior group. So in many ways, this is a meritocracy. Now, it's also based on birth because of the way that people are genetically engineered. But they are the highest class system. And they are plus, minus, double plus. So you have double plus at the very, very top. Mustafa Mond is one of the 10 world leaders. He's an alpha double plus. You have... Then underneath the alphas are the betas. Betas have some intelligence. Their positions require a little bit less thinking, but they still hold pretty high positions. So scientists or doctors, such as they are, that kind of thing, but not the people really leading and controlling things or running things. Gammas are semi-skilled. They have repetitive tasks. Deltas are underneath those. They lack individuality and tend to do menial jobs. And then right underneath those are epsilons. They cannot read or write. And they have jobs like they work in sewage, they work in foundries, they work in factories, and they're referred to as morons. So what's interesting about the science here is that, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a bit, but basically, alphas are born out of one egg. The lower classes, including the betas, are basically, they take an egg and they divide that egg. So for the epsilons, they divide the egg many, many times. And they put things into their genetic code, sort of, because Huxley really wouldn't have known about... the intricacies of DNA at the time, but basically they're given chemicals to keep them shorter. So you can kind of see, you can kind of see here that the alphas are the tallest and strongest, and then you kind of have the weaker people who are much shorter down there. So highly categorized, right? Even more so than... he's envisioning this as being 600, 700 years into the future from when he's writing. So he took the idea of the British caste system, pushed it forward a couple hundred years, and this is sort of what he came up with. War, sadness, and crime and want have all been eliminated. So you do have a seemingly utopian society, but at the same time, individuality is essentially erased, except for some of the alphas. You don't have, other than Mustafa Mond and possibly some of the other world controllers, people do not have access to literature, to other types of science, history, all of these things that don't serve the state. So coming out of this chaos, keeping people subdued and peaceful, means that you have to eliminate a lot of these things. And again, people anesthetizing themselves. So there's a drug called Soma. There's sports like obstacle golf. There's cinematic experiences called the feelies, which sometimes include pornography. People have very open sexual lives. It's not thought of as correct to be monogamous. There is no family structure. So, which is interesting because many people thought that this book was pornographic and it's been banned because of it. But he's really trying to show the dangers of those practices. So getting into the actual story, there are two Alpha Plus men, Bernard Marx and Helmholtz Watson, and they're dissatisfied with their perfect lives. One of the things I want you to watch for, we're going to talk about characterization in the second part of this lecture series, but one of the things I want you to watch for is asking who is actually the hero of this book and who is the heroine. It's not really easy to tell, and Bernard is kind of the main character, but not necessarily the hero of the story. You can also see with the names, a lot of the names are combinations of capitalist heroes and communist heroes. So people who invented things sometimes as well. Lenina Crown, named after Lenin, is a typical citizen. It's not really clear if she's an alpha or beta. It's most likely that she's a beta. She's been dating a typical alpha male, Henry Foster. She's happy and ignorant, but she's only been seeing Henry, and they have some exchanges, Lenina and her friend Fanny, about why she's only been seeing Henry, how other people believe that it's sort of odd, and I think it's interesting because you can see there the psychological conditioning. So, because it's seen as odd that she's only dating Henry, she accepts a date from Bernard. They begin dating and they plan a holiday together, so a short vacation, to a place known as the Reservation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that again in the second part of the lecture, what the Reservation is. They meet John, a savage who is born to Linda, a beta minus from London. So the Reservation is set in the southwest of the United States. They're traveling there from England. This woman, Linda, had been there on a similar trip and had been stranded there and gave birth to John. So they meet John. The rest of the novel, after that point, Bernard and Helmholtz continue to struggle with being psychologically oppressed by the society, and John struggles as he attempts to integrate and adapt to his new life. That's the basic plot of the book. I have another thing, a module for you guys in the Blackboard folder for this book about the ending, because I think sometimes people become confused by the ending. So if you get to the ending and then you're confused, then and only then can you look at that really short module. I don't want to give the ending away here. So the science and the science fiction. Science is really integral to this story. As I said, everybody begins life in the hatchery. The lower classes are one egg divided multiple times. So, interestingly, before genetic engineering and before test tube babies, so-called test tube babies, before surrogate parenting and all of that kind of stuff, this book really foreshadows a lot of that science. Psychological conditioning and sleep training are used. once people stop going to the hatchery, then they're put into schools and things like this. I don't want to get into too much detail, but as I said, there are no families. So that people are, again, if you don't have a family, you're more loyal to the state. We saw that in Anthem. And interestingly enough, the second two books in our exploration of dystopian fiction, there are families, and we'll talk about the differences of those two books later on. Because people are so dedicated to science, they really almost worship science, and they will say, our Ford instead of our God. Sometimes it's our Freud. So mixing the two together, Ford, who is known for, particularly at that time, for the assembly line and having a system where people have one kind of repetitive task. There are orgiastic meetings to stimulate or simulate religious ecstasy so that people sort of have it's a very interesting way that the state controls people, because they don't have religious freedom, but they do get the same feelings from that they would have gotten from religion by having these meetings where they whip themselves into a frenzy over Ford and see visions and things of that nature. And similarly, I don't have it, I don't think, in here, but they also have fake pregnancies for the women. So once women become a certain age, they will take a fake pregnancy pill, and it will simulate for them all of the hormonal differences that they would have gone through with a regular pregnancy. So there, and again, the pornography and the feelies kind of simulating actual intimacy. So a lot of simulation in this book instead of simulation as a way to replicate actual feeling and to replace real, true emotion. And the people who are a little bit more intelligent, some of them are sort of realizing that this fake emotion just isn't enough, including the use of an antidepressant drug, Soma. Now, I want to be very clear. There's no issue with taking antidepressants if you need them. The people in this book do not, right? So they're using it more like a recreational drug without many side effects to pacify themselves. And it's, again, a way for the government to control them. Scientific discoveries focus on entertainment, perpetuating capitalism, making money for the state, making life easy as opposed to actually better. So those are some things to look for as well as you're reading. And here is a short excerpt. Mustafa Mond said, "It isn't only art that's incompatible with happiness, it's also science. Science is dangerous. We have to keep it most carefully chained and muzzled." "What?" said Helmholtz in astonishment. "But we're always saying science is everything. It's a hypnopletic platitude. All the science propaganda we do at the college." "Yes, but what sort of science?" asked Mustafa Mond sarcastically. "You've no scientific training. You can't judge. I was a pretty good physicist in my time. Too good. Good enough to realize that all of our science is just a cookery book with an orthodox theory of cooking that nobody's allowed to question, and a list of recipes that mustn't be added to, except by special permission from the head cook. And I'm the head cook now." So what can we see here? Well, a couple things. Number one, we see the idea science is as dangerous to the people in this society, or at least to the rulers, as religion would be, or freedom of press, or freedom of speech. And that they're really using science, an orthodox theory of cooking, that you have a cookbook and this is what you do, right? You follow those recipes. You don't just take all the ingredients and mix them together and see what you come up with. And the other thing too, the hypnopedic platitude, that means something to calm people, a platitude, a common saying, and the hypnopedic are the hypnosis that is being used on children while they sleep. So they're doing this, they're using propaganda. One of the things that they tell people is science is everything. Science is wonderful. A good world is a scientific world, right? These are things that are repeated to them over and over and over till they believe them, including Helmholtz, who is an alpha plus. So he is at the top of the heap, and even he is surprised to learn that science is being kept back. Not just art that's incompatible with happiness. That's the other thing, right? To keep the people happy. And I think one of the things, that I would say to look for as you are reading this book and the other two books as well, particularly Matched, because it's also very much based in science. Would it be worth it? Would it be worth it to have the illusion of happiness and to not know, almost like the Matrix, to not know what's going on behind the Matrix, to live in the dream, to take your Soma tablet and to enjoy the movies and have fun playing obstacle golf, and in this book have sex with whoever you want? Would that be worth it? To not have war and to not have famine and to not have want. Would it be worth it? I think that is a more difficult question in this book, particularly because the people are being controlled by positive reinforcement instead of negative reinforcement. In Ayn Rand's book Anthem, it's really clear, no, this is a very oppressive society. People need to escape. There's no freedom. There's no individuality. Everything's been erased. In this society of Brave New World, that's not as clear. So that's something that I would like you to keep in mind. Coming up, part 2 of Brave New World, we're going to dig into some of the characters and some of the themes. And I hope that you got something out of this and learned something. And I hope that you can take it with you as you read. Thanks, guys.